things that we've heard before. So we'll just come back to those as we move into the questions about alternative models or approaches to IQ. I couldn't think of a better term to be as inclusive with this as I can possibly be from the onset. So what are the core premises of alternative models or approaches to IQ, or perhaps said in a different way, why is IQ a myth? Why doesn't that work?
I think you'd be hard-pressed to find these core principles of so-called alternative models, because in different theorists have really tried different things. I think that what they certainly all share in common is an understanding that IQ is woefully inadequate as a definition of intelligence. So I think that that's the starting point for all different attempts. And there's been so many of them, right? I mean, the Giffords models, and Thorndike's social intelligence, and later on emotional and multiple intelligences by Gardner. I mean, it's very difficult to find out, strong commonality or core principles across all of these models, except for the fact that they all point out to the Sternbergs. I should have mentioned as well, Robert Sternberg. He's another clear thinker, I think. Not in everything, but I mean, he's got very good insights every now and again. And so I think that what they have in common is their understanding of the inadequacy of IQ as a definition and leading model, mainstream model of intelligence is woefully narrow and inadequate. So that's what I would say they have in common. But other than that, they diverge very significantly in how they approach the topic.
Narrow, and I think that's a key point. In what way is IQ narrow?
In so many different ways. And again, I would say if if somebody's interested in intelligence, I would recommend my radix intelligence article, because I also, one of the things that I do before I get into radix intelligence and the need for this integrated model, I pinpoint some of the very widely understood limitations of IQ. Like, for example, narrow means that it just looks at a very, very small, a sliver of the entire domain of intelligence and what it means to be intelligent. And we've got so many examples of individuals with very low IQ scores that have went on and done tremendous things in life. And simply, just one case like that, just one case, and of course, there's thousands, but just one case like that, brings the whole model into focus. Because if you say, IQ, is really intelligence, and you can't function, and you can't do this, and you can't do the other, and you find somebody, with an IQ of 40, 50, 60, who's become a superstar in multiple areas. And what the example I think that I gave in the paper, if I remember now, so I haven't read it in a while, but Muhammad Ali. All right, I mean, this guy was turned down by the American army because of his low IQ. I mean, he was deemed deficient, and this guy went on and became so important, so influential, so successful in so many different areas of life. It's just one example. There's so many other examples also from the area, so I'm not very familiar with it, but autism and idiot savants is another case where you have like people with extremely low IQs that can do tremendous feats. So, there's all sorts of, and of course, there's the other literature that's always, what's the word? Under highlighted, let's or underappreciated in the mainstream conceptions of intelligence, that shows the negative effects of high IQ, how it is positively related with all sorts of psychological illnesses, all sorts of psychological malfunctions, suicide attempts. So an index that's supposed to be measuring intelligence and correlates positively with suicide attempts and all sorts of psychological maladaptation is woefully inadequate. I mean, if you're intelligent, you're so intelligent, how come your life's falling apart, Yes.
So what are more promising ways of thinking about intelligence then?
More promising ways, so I mentioned some of the colleagues, other researchers who have done looked at the alternative models, and I think each of these represents possibilities. I used to be tremendously critical of Gardner's stuff, tremendously critical, and with good reason for many of his statements. But generally speaking, when you look at I haven't looked at his stuff again, reread it many years after the first time. I thought he was trying to move in the right direction, even though he's hung up about a lot of things, and he was trying to move in the right direction in the sense of like expanding intelligence to its proper conclusion, right? So all these things, the intelligence is not simply being able to take intelligence tests or solving riddles per minute. Well, that's what an IQ test is. There's also the intelligence of dancing. There is the intelligence of running. There is the intelligence of producing music. These are all intelligent behaviors. There's simply no question about that in my mind anymore. You have to be completely arbitrary and say, well, all these things, we're going to call them non-cognitive, and we're going to exclude them from the definition. They're going to call them something, we're going to talents or abilities, and they just get into semantic debates and arguments. I mean, there's no reason why these things should be excluded from intelligence. And so yes, I mean, rereading his work, I found a lot of interesting stuff in there. Of course, I disagree, with all this, and you'll find in most alternative conceptions of intelligence, they're always looking for it somewhere in the brain, and I have major disagreement with that. But that's another thing. I mean, the idea that you should actually expand intelligence to encompass all sorts of things that we have left out simply because we can't test them through IQ tests. You see, that's the only justification at the end of the day, because you can't measure them, you can't fit them into the IQ G conception, then they're going to have to be left out. I just call them non-cognitive or irrelevant or abstract. That just doesn't cut it for me, I don't think. And then you end up, with IQ scores and whatever it is that they measure.
I think you make a really interesting point here. Gardner proposed his theory of multiple intelligences and mapped out criteria for identifying those intelligences. And one of the main critiques of his approach tends to be that no measurements have been developed to capture these. And so this brings me to the question, do we need to be able to assess an intelligence for it to be an intelligence or to qualify as such?
Well, absolutely not. I mean, as academics, if you need to produce papers and do all this jazz, and then yes, because we have taken it, as a given that if you pose an intelligence, then you've got to be able to measure it. But certainly, my definition of radix intelligence is an infinite concept. You cannot measure it because it's infinite. It's everywhere. You're surrounded by intelligence, and you are intelligence yourself, minus your personal delusion. So intelligence is an infinite concept. Therefore, it cannot be measured. It's completely wrong. The other thing, a lot of things that we were taking for granted, certainly, in psychometrics. I don't know, you might have come across this saying that says everything that exists in some quantity, and therefore it can be measured, which is an axiom of psychometrics. Well, I used to teach that. I still teach it sometimes, with caveats, because that's the mainstream view. If something exists, it exists in some quantity, and therefore we ought to be able to measure it. If not today, then 5 years down the line, sometime in the future. Well, that's absolutely not true. If something is infinite, if it exists infinitely, how do you measure? For something to be measurable, it needs to be limited. It needs to be finite. Yes. So